We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Landfill and Underground Storage Tank Investigation Technical Guidance Training. My name is George Nicholas. I'm a geologist with the Bureau of Groundwater Pollution Assessment. I'm also involved with overseeing the department's technical guidance development, as well as working with the department's training or site remediation programs training program. So I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. I'd like to also welcome our web audience. We are live, Joe? Good deal. So welcome everyone on the web. We certainly appreciate your attendance and participation. Just want to remind everyone, because we do have a web audience, there will be 2 question and answer periods today. During both of those question and answer periods, we're very adamant that anyone who does have a question within the audience, please wait for us to get a microphone to you. We have, I myself will be running one of the mics around, and Kathi Coons is an assistant for us, will be running the other mic around. It's very important that everyone hears the question as well as the answer. So if you will please be patient with us, we'll make sure to get you the mic for that. Also, I'd ask everyone to please turn their cell phones to mute or turn them off. I'm going to do the same because occasionally I forget myself. Also, just a few logistical, yeah, see, I didn't have it on mute. Just a few logistical points. Out the doors and to the left are a set of restrooms. Also out the doors and to the right across the foyer is another set of restrooms. And if you continue further on and make a left down the hallway, there's the DEP cafeteria there where you can get coffee during the break. There's also some refreshments in the back of the room, courtesy of the LSRPA, and we would certainly encourage you to take advantage of that. I'd also like to thank today's speakers. We have Dan Toder, who's Vice President with Hatch-Macdonald. He's also Director of Community Outreach with the LSRPA. He'll be giving us a brief overview of the LSRPA. We also have John Doyon from NJDEP's Office of Brownfields Reuse, Kathi Stetser with Rue Associates, Inc., and also Ted Toscas with AMEC Environmental Services. I'd also like to thank the training committee for a site remediation program, who does a lot of work in doing dry runs and putting these sessions on. Hopefully you will give us some feedback. I want to encourage you to use the evaluation forms that are within your packet today. And also on the web, before you log out, please give us a little bit of feedback on how well we're doing. We certainly tailor every training session we have according to the feedback that we get. So without any further ado, we will introduce Dan Toder from the LSRPA. Give us a little brief overview of the LSRPA. Dan?
Thank you, George. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everybody out on the webinar. My name is Dan Toder, as George told you, from Hatch-Macdonald, and I'm always up here representing the LSRPA and letting the members of our organization know what's going on, what we've done, and what we plan to do, and that's why I'm here today as well. The first thing I want to do I do this? Okay. I want to thank our sponsors, as I always do. We're supported by our sponsors, membership fees from our members, and also we've started to put on some courses that have brought us in some funding. So that's how we're supported. But the sponsors, I'd like to thank them, as I always do: Accutest Laboratories, AquaProtect Labs, Alpha Laboratories, AWT Environmental, Borba Surveying, East Coast Drilling, ESI Enviro Solutions, next slide, Hampton-Clarke Veritech Laboratories, Integrated Analytical Laboratories, Northstar Environmental Services, Riker Danzig, Attorneys at Law, and Summit Drilling. And I used to get up here, and we only had 1 slide of sponsors, and now I'm proud to say we have 2 slides full. So things are getting better for the association all the time. Let me tell you what we've been doing for the LSRPs out there. Many of them are preparing to take the test in a little more than a week now, on the 14th. There's a lot of nervous people out there. And to ease their stress, the LSRPA put on a couple of exam review courses in April. We had some very positive feedback. A lot of people came to me and said that the course was good in that I found out what my weaknesses are, what I have to study, and what I'm strong in. And that was the exact purpose of the class. And now people know what they have to look at, what they have to focus on in preparation for the exam. There was one evaluation form that came back, and it asked, what did you think of the course overall? And the person wrote back and said, the course was great if I pass the test, but the course will be terrible if I fail. And that about sums it up. But the general overall feedback was pretty good. So for everybody that's going to take that first exam, good luck on that exam. I hope you all pass, and your nervousness goes away for a little while anyway. We are going to continue having these review courses for the next 3 exams. There's going to be one on May 14th, and then there's going to be 3 more. The next exam is scheduled, I have heard, for September 24th. There's already a date for the second exam. So the LSRPA plans on putting on another review course just after Labor Day. So if you're not going to take the first test, or if you don't do so well on the first test and you want to take a course to review for the second test offered, then that's about when we're going to plan the next course. I think we're only going to have it in one location, centrally located, because we're envisioning that a lot of the LSRPs that are taking it the first time won't need to take it the second time. No comments. The other thing we're planning in the fall, in October, is an ethics course. As the LSRPs probably know by now, there is a requirement for every 3-year renewal cycle that the LSRPs have to take an ethics class. And we're going to offer the first one probably in October, and that's worth 7 credits towards your LSRP continuing education requirement for your next license renewal. So that's the first time we're going to offer that. So keep that in the back of your mind. And also we're planning some quarterly membership meetings with hot topics so that the members can listen in or bring issues to the forum themselves, and we're hoping to have those quarterly. The first one, I think, is going to be about the LSRP and their liabilities and their business practice and insurance issues and things like that that the LSRPs are right now concerned about. So that's what that first hot topic is going to be about. And that about summarizes what we plan to do. Could I have the next slide? I forget. Okay. First exam, we went all through that. We had, here are the 2 courses, April 16th and the 25th that we had. Next one. Here was the outline of the class. If you were there, you know that we went through the LSRP and site remediation process. Next one. And why join the LSRP? It's always a good idea. Here are the benefits you get. By the way, if you take continuing ed courses as an LSRP, there are always these discounts that the organization gets. So if you take 3 courses throughout a year, you're going to be paying for your membership pretty much. So it's a good idea to sign up. It's $150 a year. Next slide. And you'll be paying for your membership just by taking the courses and getting the discounts. So I recommend it highly. Thank you very much. Enjoy the session. And again, good luck to the LSRPs taking the first exam. Thank you. George?
Thanks, Dan. Just want to give everybody a opportunity to fill out those evaluation sheets. Perhaps you could indicate that the moderator should announce the correct training program. It is not the underground storage tanks. As I said, it actually is the site investigation, remedial investigation, remedial action training. We just had the other one recently, and apparently I did not update my slides. So you are in the correct training course, in case if you didn't realize that. And I just wanted to right now give you a quick overview of the guidance process. The idea is a lot of this is review for people who have been attending these courses. This is something that we do every time, but the idea is it's good to have a good idea on exactly how the guidance was prepared in order to understand the training. And so we'll go over that just very quickly. Next slide, Joe. Just to understand the composition of the guidance committees. They were composed of 2 to 3 DEP staff, 5 to 7 outside stakeholders. Those people were selected to bring a balance to the table of technical expertise, regulatory knowledge, and practical application. Entirely, I would say that has been a great benefit to all of the committees. They've worked very well together, focused on the science, and have created, in every case, I think, excellent documents. Today's a great example of that. Also, the task that they were given clearly was to develop a guidance document that could be used by LSRPs and the regulated community. In addition to that, they had to work with the people who were working on the tech regs to make sure that nothing fell through the cracks. As you all well know, that the tech regs really were revised to be a little bit more performance-oriented. A lot of the how-to was taken out of the tech regs and put into guidance, and that's why we're here today on a particular soils guidance document. In addition to that, they were tasked with developing training, and we certainly thank the trainers today who put in a lot of time and effort not only to develop the slides, but to work with the training program in order to polish it. Next slide, please. As far as the review process, many people who have gone through peer review journal articles, you realize that the review process is very important. It provides a lot of feedback to the people writing the documents. Oftentimes people writing documents very focused on that document and don't consider certain aspects. Getting that kind of feedback to review on a document is very important. However, for us it was important to also balance that against receiving too many comments that would cripple the process. An example of that close was the vapor intrusion technical guidance. Received almost 800 comments, took them quite a while to address all those comments. We tasked the committees with also providing a response to comments, which is posted on our website. One of the issues is when we have too many comments, it takes them so long to get through that the document potentially would never get issued. So we had to balance that, and I think we came up with a pretty good process. The process involves internal review within the DEP from SRP managers and interested staff, and also outside stakeholders. Every stakeholder on a DEP guidance committee, technical guidance committee, was asked to conduct a review themselves and also to conduct a review within their respective constituencies, and then funnel those comments back to the committee chair. And that has worked very well. In addition to that, we've asked the SRP steering committee to take a high-level view to look at the documents and to identify with us anything that would be would preclude the document from being used, and they've done that as well. And I think that the process has worked very well. We're always looking for improvements, so if you have any ideas, please let us know. Next slide. This is a list of the documents that have been issued so far. There's 16 guidance documents that have been completed. I think that's a lot of good work has been done. We have 3 left to go. Technical and Practicability just closed their comment period recently on their draft document. The attainment document is out for comment right now. That comment period closes on May 16th. So if you have an interest in reviewing that document, please do so and get your comments back to us by May 16th. All those comments are funneled back to the committee chair. Analytical Methods is still working on the draft document. They have not issued that yet. When they will, that will follow the same process that we have for review. All of our documents are posted on the DEP guidance library. The address for that on the website is provided at the bottom of the slide. Next slide. This is something I wanted to identify. We're almost at the end of our training. One of the last 3 documents that we have that we will be training on probably will not be ready until September. But in the interim period, we do have a lot of work that the training program is working on. We're working on training on the soon-to-be-issued rules. That would be the ARCS training, ISRA, and US rules. In addition to that, we're working on the tech regs. Just wanted to let internal DEP staff know that there is a schedule for that, and we hope that you signed up for that. That's a mandatory requirement. In addition to that, we will be providing training to outside stakeholders at the dates that are listed. Those for the outside stakeholders would be held on June 19th and 21st at Rutgers, and then June 27th at the Eco Complex. That is an all-day class, 8 to 4. The morning we will be doing the ARCS, ISRA, and US training, and then in the afternoon we will cover the tech regs. Next one. Initially, when the tech regs were written, we didn't envision the LSRP initiative. And one problem that we did identify in terms of rule and guidance was that the tech regs dealt with them in the same way. Rule and guidance required the same process, really, if you varied from rule or if you departed from using department guidance. That does not work with the LSRP system that we have, and so what we needed to do was issue a policy paper just describing how the department would handle that. This really is not going to be needed for much longer for when the tech regs are issued this policy paper will not necessarily be usable in that respect, but it does have information on exactly what we do expect for if you deviate from guidance and how to handle that. Next slide. Again, this is to identify departing from department guidance. As you know, department guidance is not mandatory, but it does provide a acceptable method or approach for handling a lot of the site investigation, remedial actions. But when someone does not use department guidance, it's necessary for them to explain what they did and why they did it and why it's appropriate and why it's still protective of human health and the environment. And they might say, well, that's great, but why do we need to do that? It's pretty clear that not only does the department need that, if we review documents and we need to have that information, if there's not enough information in there justifying exactly why a decision was made, it's going to hold up processing of those documents and issuance of an RAO. In addition to that, from an LSRPA or an LSRP perspective, if you take over a site where an LSRP has already done previous work, it's important for you to know what was done at that site, why it was done, and that it is protected, because you're making decisions based on previous work as well as the work that you're undertaking. So it's very important to comprehensively explain what you did. Of course, that explanation is relative to the complexity of the site. Next slide, please. It's just to identify, we were very interested in getting feedback on the document usability within the field when people take those documents out, the guidance documents out. Is there problems with understanding them, with using them in the field? We'd like to know that. This is a mechanism that we're using. This feedback link is on the department website. We encourage anyone who has that kind of information to get it back to us. It allows us to make improvements and to improve the process and the guidance that we have out there. In addition to that, we would like to know about any updates in technologies that would make the documents important or more relevant. Clearly, if we have guidance on technologies that are old, it really doesn't help people out in the field. So if there are updates in the technology, we'd like to know about them. We'd like to have the ability to update our documents, and the committee chairs would make that evaluation on how to do that. We'd also like new topics for guidance. Is there issues out there that LSRPs would like guidance on, even the department internally? Is there issues? Some suggestions have been it would be great if we had updated CEA guidance. I think there's also been some suggestions on maybe we should develop guidance on pesticides, but I think there's a lot of issues out there. We don't necessarily have committees or technical guidance committees started on that, but if you think it's appropriate, please make that suggestion. We'll take that into consideration. So I think that is it. Great. Next up, I would like to introduce John Doyon, who will take the guidance from here. Again, there will be 2 question and answer periods. Please hold your questions for those times, and we will make sure to answer all the questions. So that's it. John, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. As George said, I'm John Doyon, and welcome to the training for site investigation, remedial investigation, and remedial action verification sampling for soil. It's a mouthful. I'm here with Kathi Stetser from RU Associates and Ted Toscas from AMEC, and we're going to be providing the training today. This is a list of the people that were on the committee that put this guidance together. I just want to throw out a thank you to all these people. They were very helpful and really important in getting this guidance document together. So really the purpose of us being here today is to basically provide that guidance on site investigation, remedial investigation, and verification sampling for remedial actions for soil. Just to give you, I guess, a little bit of a history here. Prior to Monday, May 7th, the tech regs were the what and the how to conduct a remedial investigation. And as part of the LSRP process, and I guess the whole concept of it is we are pulling out that how from the tech regs, and after May 7th, the tech regs will still be the what, but the guidance documents are going to be how to do it. And this guidance is going to be, or is there for investigation of soils. So just give you a breakdown of what we're going to be covering today. Site investigation will be done by Kathi Stetser. That's going to be followed by natural background with Ted Toscas, and we'll have a question and break after that, and then we'll go into the remedial investigation and then remedial action. And with that, I think we're here with Kathi. Thank you.
Will you advance my slides for me? Okay. I'm Kathi Stetser, an LSRP with RU, and I'm going to confess that I went to the midnight showing of the Avengers last night, and I'm going on 3 hours of sleep because I'm a big nerd. So if I'm a little slower than usual, please bear with me. Site investigation, very important. Dick is laughing at me. Next slide, please. What's the goal of a site investigation? It is to conduct sampling in potential or known areas of concern to target the highest contaminant concentrations that might be there. You want to identify if there are exceedances of the applicable remediation standards, and then you want to determine if additional work is required. Why do you need to do an SI? When do you need to do an SI? Couple things that actually trigger the need. A bunch are associated with if you've identified contaminated AOCs associated with completing a PA. You do a PA if you've got an ISRA trigger, if the desire is to have a site-wide remediation document, if you are remediating a site or a portion of a site to be a child care center or a school, or if in accordance with the Madden bill you are looking to get a license for a child care center or you're renewing your license. So that's all associated with the PA and then boiling it down to the AOCs that need to be sampled. It's also an SI when you're doing your sampling after closing a regulated underground storage tank. And to me that seems a little not obvious. I don't always think of that as being an SI because I've just done something. I've done something that feels like remediation. But the state considers that sampling that you do an SI, even though a lot of consultants will call that an underground storage tank closure report. It's important in the new regulatory framework because you need to remember that you're subject to all of the time frames and associated rules that go with an SI, such as a receptor evaluation, getting your SI done within the regulatory time frame of 1 year or the mandatory time frame of 2 years. And also you want to submit the SI form with that underground storage tank site investigation report, or someone will call you and tell you to turn one in. And also if you're ordered to do so by a court. One thing that is not considered an SI in the rule is if you are collecting samples following a reportable discharge. So your tank explodes and you call the hotline and you're out there collecting samples. It's not an SI. That's going to be an RI, or maybe you're going to do, dig it up at the same time and it's an RI-RA. But it's not an SI, so don't send a form in with an SI for that. Public service announcement. Next slide, please. So in the guidance, which maybe some of you read, and I'm sure all of you are going to, there's some general comments and recommendations for site investigation. And then it goes into detailed about various AOCs. It's all the specificity that used to be in the rule until Monday when we have our new rule. And that's all come out, and it's in guidance. And obviously, it's a good thing to look at. If you've got some features that you're going to go sample, take a look at the guidance. I got a drum storage pad, I got a compressor, I got a pit. See what the guidance says. It's probably a good rule of thumb. It doesn't mean that it's always the right answer. Professional judgment is always going to come into play based on site-specific conditions, but it's a good baseline to start with to see what the group and the DEP thought was a reasonable approach. Alternate strategies may certainly apply, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit. The goal is to detect contamination. Something else to keep in mind is that back in the olden days, an SI meant we're going to go collect soil samples. And then once we get our data, then our RI will be other things. Those days are gone. Make sure you take a look at the groundwater guidance, the eco guidance. An SI can include whatever media is necessary to preliminary evaluate an AOC. So it could be sediment, it could be surface water, it could be ground, it almost certainly is groundwater. So make sure you take a look at those guidance documents also. Next slide. So here's the types of AOCs that are typically found at an industrial or a commercial site. These are the AOCs that are discussed in guidance. And And there certainly could be others, but these are some of the common ones. Two that I want to point out, rail lines specifically is in red. It's new. There's some new concepts in the guidance about sampling rail lines, and this is mostly for ISRA sites. Historically, for anybody who did a lot of ISRA work over the last 20 years, 19 years I guess, that you would sample loading and unloading areas associated with rail lines. You'd sample, I like to call them train stains, where the train is leaked and there's a big gooey stain on the ground. But we didn't typically go along those rail lines and collect samples. Now as LSRPs, we're going to be asked to be issuing final remediation documents for an entire site. And that's a media that we know sometimes, often, is impacted either from historic fill or from the train operations, the brakes, the lube oil. So we really need to consider that when we're developing our sampling strategy and what our ultimate closure goals are. One thing to definitely keep in mind is if you're changing site use from industrial to residential or some more restrictive use with sensitive populations, making sure that you've covered these rail lines are not only going to be important for when you submit your document, but also to cover your liability in the future. If you've issued a site-wide RAO unrestricted and then somebody goes and finds a bunch of PAHs or some strange metals when they're trying to build a housing development, it's just not going to go well. Another thing I'd like to point out is transformers. It's something we talked about in the guidance or the exam training that generated some discussion, so I'll pause and bring it up today, is that transformers are an AOC. When you're doing a PA or you're looking at AOCs, transformers are something you need to look at. Sometimes there's a sticker on that transformer that says non-PCB containing. That doesn't mean it doesn't have PCBs. A lot of times they'll be like, oh, it's non-PCB containing, I don't need to sample this. It just means that it has less than 50 ppm of PCBs in the fluid. The non-residential standard is 1. So keep in mind that a transformer, unless you know it never contained dielectric fluid, you need to consider it as an AOC. Next slide. So what are the areas that are typically evaluated when you're doing an SI? The obvious ones are where stuff used to be made and stored and where it's made and stored now, the actual process areas. But things to also keep in mind is there's a bunch of areas away from the operations that could contain areas, AOCs that need to be sampled. And usually these are identified during your diligent inquiry, your interviews, your aerial photo reviews, Sanborn reviews. There might be drainage swales or a pond or a lagoon or an old disposal area or a landfill that's away from the area. Keep in mind that the area of your manufacturing is not the only place where you would typically be collecting SI samples. And building interiors, it's kind of tricky, and something to keep in mind is that there's two kind of ways to look at building interiors. When you're doing phase 1, you're looking at lead-based paint and there's your asbestos-containing materials. And as site remediation people, we don't really care about that because that hasn't fallen on the ground. But, next slide please. Building interiors means something different from a site investigation and a PA perspective. And that's, you want to sample contaminants that are inside a building that could have gotten outside the building. So many times I look at old PASIs and there's this manufacturing facility and there's hundreds of samples outside the building and there's nothing inside the building. And you go in the building and there's floor drains and there's pits and there's pipes and there's a boiler, and nobody ever looked at those features that have been leaking underneath the building for 50 years. So you got to make sure you go in the building and look for things that could have leaked to get outside. And some things aren't even obvious. An example of one of my sites, we have a manufacturing facility. There's an eye wash station with a drain. Who cares? It's water. It's not an AOC. Except somebody set up a compressor like 10 feet away from it that was blowing goo and compressor blow down to the ground, and there was this little trail of oil and water to my floor drain for my eye wash station. That has now become an AOC. So you got to think about those migration pathways and what's going on inside. Another one is if it could be contaminants outside that could get inside, which doesn't happen that often, but there's definitely times when you go into a building in a basement and the sump is full of oil and there's a greasy stain all over the floor from every time the water table got high and the basement flooded because there's an underground storage tank outside that's leaking and has LNAPL all over the place. So you're seeing that manifestation of an outside contaminant inside a building. Sometimes you see a greasy stain on a wall because there's an apple on the water table outside. Or even if there's dissolved phase chemicals in the groundwater, you go inside a basement of a manufacturing facility and it's like Carlsbad Caverns. You've got stalactites and things on the wall from the chemicals precipitating out. That would be an AOC. Something that the guidance committee wanted me to bring up is, although lead-based paint and asbestos floor tiles and pipe wrap aren't something that we would investigate as part of a site investigation, there are certainly things that the responsible party or a future developer should take into consideration outside of the framework of site remediation in light of whatever their future site use is. So we do, as professionals, need to be concerned about those sorts of things, just not necessarily as part of our site investigation. So now you're ready to develop your sampling plan. You know where your AOCs are, you know what they are. How are you going to approach your sampling plan? Well, obviously you're going to read the guidance and see what that has to say. But the preliminary conceptual site model is very important at this stage of the remediation. If you haven't read the conceptual site model guidance, please get it. It's not that long. It's a really important document. It's going to be an incredibly useful tool for LSRPs and responsible parties moving forward. To boil it down very succinctly, is you're looking at the source, potential pathways, and potential receptors, and taking into consideration the entire framework of the site, the geology, the hydrology, the topography, the surface drainage, the contaminants, the way they behave. But you want to look at all of that and boil it down to a very simple concept, I think, when I'm training new people at my company, talking to the field staff about how to determine where to sample. And this is going to sound silly, but it's true. Think like the contamination. You're the oil in the compressor that's leaking on the ground. Look at the ground. Where are you going to go? What's your path? Are you a thick, sticky thing that's going to pool in one spot, or are you really thin and you're going to run and go into the ground? It really helps to boil it down to something that simple when you're trying to figure out where the most contaminated location could be. An example of when it's not always the place right next to your feature. I have a site that's got a drum storage pad. Beautiful concrete, great shape, surrounded by lovely concrete in great shape. I don't really see a reason to sample there because there's no cracks, there's no stains, but I don't know what happened, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. There's a storm drain near it. That storm drain goes into the ground, out the back, and into a lagoon. That's probably the first place I'm going to sample, because if I were the contamination, where I would expect the highest concentrations to be might be at the drain if it's in bad shape, but it might be out in the lagoon where the discharge was going. So think like the contamination. Another important thing to think about is your AOC history. Has there been reported discharges that people know about? Talk to some guy who was there when this pipe was leaking for 3 days. Where did it go? Do you have any pictures? Was any remediation conducted? Classic missing of stuff is when you're going back in 10 years, 15 years after an underground storage tank's been pulled, and they pulled it and they dug up some dirt and they backfilled it and nobody ever collected any samples. So now you got to go in and figure out if there's any contamination. But you got to be really careful that you're not sampling the backfill. You need to have an understanding of that spatial relationship of the fill material and the natural soils, because sampling backfill for this purpose isn't terribly useful. You'll miss the soil that you're actually shooting for. Next. So your SI sampling plan is going to have size, location, and by the way, an SI sampling plan is not required to be submitted to the department. You do need to have a quality assurance plan in your files to be submitted, but it's always a good idea to have a plan. Your client's going to want to know what you're doing, and your field people are going to need to know what you're doing, and writing it down helps you think about it. Winging this sort of thing is not always the best idea. So you're going to list these obvious things. If you don't know what contaminant spilled, you really need to look at subchapter 2 of the tech regs, and it tells you what parameters. There's that table 2-1 that gives you the parameters for petroleum. And if you don't know, it says you need to default to the full list, and that's TCl, TAL, PAH, or EPH, pH, and hex chrome, which is a lot, but if you don't know what's spilled, a couple samples of that full suite is going to help you hone in on what your contamination might be. Next slide. All right, this is always the big one. You've created this beautiful sampling plan in your office, and it is fantastic. And you go out to the site, and there's overhead pipes, and there's subgrade lines, and there's brand new parking lot that nobody wants you to drill through, and you're like, oh, great. Considering access early will save you a lot of pain and a lot of doing free work. It's true. It's very possible that alternate methods are going to need to be considered just because for health and safety reasons or just from strictly access reasons, you can't get to the spot that makes the most sense. So then you need to really put on your thinking cap and design something that allows you to collect the data you need, that's reproducible, that is protective, but that may be a little bit different than just collecting a soil sample right at the location. An example that I have from one of my sites, which was crazy, we designed a sampling plan knowing it's a bulk petroleum storage facility. It's got 15 pipeline easements on it, around it, through it, not my clients, other people. So we knew the pipes were there, and we designed our sampling plan so that we weren't drilling through their pipes, but you got to meet with all the pipeline representatives. And we get out there, we have like 75 samples on our sampling plan. By the time we were done, we had 30. They're like, oh no, you can't drill there, you can't drill there, and no way. So we had to get creative. We still needed this data to evaluate our AOCs, but you're not going to drill near these pipelines. We're just not going to let you, and I respect that. So we used a combination of soil samples where we could get them, soil gas samples, which are shallow, and they let us put some holes there, and some down gradient groundwater samples to kind of fill that gap where we normally would have just pounded a bunch of soil samples in. It's just an example. There's probably lots of ways to approach this, but you may need to get creative based on your access constraints. This is something that is so critical and so often overlooked because in the rush of getting out into the field, you've made your sampling plan, you've identified your AOCs, your field people are going off to collect their samples. Sit down and talk with them about exactly what they need to be recording in the field. As an LSRP, this is your only link to documenting what was done and that it was done properly. One thing I always have my field people do is when they get back in the office, I want them to scan the field books. Maybe make photocopies and put them in the file. How many field books have ended up on the New Jersey Turnpike because people left them on the roof of their car? Your data is gone. And now you're trying to reconstruct your logs or why somebody collected a sample in a certain place. Or if you end up in front of the board and they're asking you questions and your field book's in a ditch on the side of the turnpike. Make sure, it seems simple and silly, but don't lose your field notes. It's really bad. That's really the most important point. Next. So you're out here collecting samples and you're finding stuff. There are definitely times when you need to notify the department. And there may be more than this, but these are the big ones that we came up with when we were getting ready for the guidance training. Obviously, if you've identified a discharge at the site, either from your site or from an upgrading property, and that discharge has not been reported to the department, the hotline needs to be called. If you identify an IEC, the hotline needs to be called. Munitions or material presenting a potential explosive hazard, which apparently is called MPPEH, which I didn't know. Call 911 because this is probably an issue, and call the hotline. And anthropogenic radioactive material is something that's discussed in the PA guidance. If you identify that, you don't need to call the hotline. You can decide for yourself if you think you need to call 911. But there is a checkbox on the PASI form that you would note that this is there, and the DEP will probably reach out to you and have some sort of interaction and oversight while that work's being done. These are all discussed in the PA and the soil guidance. The reporting obligations are discussed in SARA, they're discussed in ARCs, they're everywhere. Definitely be familiar with what the reporting requirements are for responsible parties and LSRPs. So you've got your data, and now you're going to write a report. Much of, as we said, much of the specificity has been taken out of the rule and put into guidance. The rule should be out on Monday. Take a look at it. It's going to specifically give you, and I've seen the draft, but I'm not sure what's in the final. It specifically tells you what you need to have in your report in the rule. It should be these sorts of things. A description of your AOCs, a presentation of what you did in the field, and backup with your boring logs and your field sampling sheets or whatever it is you have. A summary of the analytical results that also includes a full copy of the lab data package and your HAS disk. And then you need to have recommendations, either that everything was great, it was clean, and you don't need to do anything else, or that you identified impact and further remediation is needed. The discussions need to be comprehensive enough to support your conclusions. So if you're making conclusions and you hand it to your buddy in the office to read it and they're like, I don't know why you drew this conclusion, clearly you need to bulk up your description. This is the only thing between you and whoever's maybe screening or reading your document. They need to be able to understand how you came to the conclusions that you did. When you're turning in reports, 1 paper copy, 3 electronic copies, I believe is what is stated in the regulation. Finally, our favorite topic, forms. Forms, yeah, exactly, Dick. And I talked with Josh Gradwell yesterday, and he corrected one thing on my slide, so I will let you know. Forms for submission with an SI report. Right now, the SI form is attached to the PA form. It's a PA SI form. I've heard rumors that that might be split, but it's not split yet. Sometimes it's a little confusing if you didn't do a PA first and you're just doing an SI. There's definitely parts on that form that don't apply. Don't panic. But that's the form that needs to go in right now. You're going to submit a case inventory document identifying the AOCs and letting people know what media is impacted, what the contaminants of concern are. It's a place for you to memorialize those AOCs, and that case inventory document continues to follow along with you until you're done. And every day I'm learning more things that I'm supposed to put on it with my compliance assistance calls. So I think it's a document in transition, but it's useful and it's really helpful for everyone to kind of orient what's going on at the site. If you are done at the end of your SI, you're going to be ready to submit your RAO and your RAO form. Except Josh told me, and I didn't know this, apparently I've been breaking the rules, you need to submit your annual fee before you issue the RAO. I've been doing it all at once. Whoops, I won't do that anymore. I know. So keep that in mind. If you're ready to be done, pay your fee before you write that RAO letter and date it. And that's it. And Ted is next, and we'll take questions after Ted.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about natural background investigations for soils. Let's see. Good. Yes. There's times when, in the course of an investigation, we will find out that contaminants that are present at the site or an AOC may, in fact, be naturally occurring compounds that are not related to site operations. Typically, that those types of contaminants are metals, and we know that the DEP and the Geological Survey have over the years conducted statewide investigations and have published documents that provide some really good information on the on background natural background contamination, and it's a good idea to take a look at those documents when you think that you may have issues with natural background contamination at the site. Next slide, please. The reason this is so important, and we're talking about it, is because you're not required to remediate natural background. So, next slide. So let's say we suspect that we have natural background contamination at a site. So what do? Well, we have to find a location at the site that, from a media standpoint, is about as similar as you can make it to your area of concern in terms of the physical, the chemical, the geological, the biological characteristics, but it has not been affected by site activities at the site. I've included a little picture of a facility there. Well, perhaps in a situation like that, the place to go look for a background would be somewhere in the wooded area that hopefully we know that hasn't been affected by what went on at the site. Next slide. So we need to collect probably about 10 samples just so that we have a statistically valid sample. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in the background area, replicate the samples that we collected from our AOC. So whatever depth we collected them at the AOC, the same depth we got to go collect them at the background area. Next slide. Again, stressing that the samples should be collected from areas that have not been affected by site operations, and we got to confirm that in our minds in as many ways as possible. So you got to go back to your PA, make sure that you know that the area hasn't been affected, look at all aerial photographs, make sure the area hasn't been affected, and even some less evident things like it would be nice if the background area is perhaps topographically higher than than the rest of the site. So even though there were not operations, things didn't get carried there through erosion. Just really want to make sure that you have a good case that what you're calling the background sampling area is in fact the background sampling area and didn't get tainted in the process. So we'll run through a couple of examples of how the data will be processed to show that in fact what we're calling background is background. So next slide. We're dealing with environmental data, so the first thing we got to do is check that the data is normally or not log normally distributed, just for the purpose of having some numbers to work up an example here. We're assuming that perhaps at our site we're trying to determine whether some arsenic hits that we've seen in an area of concern are in fact background and are not related to site operation. Of course, arsenic commonly occurs as a natural background contaminant, so we said, all right, let's pretend that we're looking at arsenic. The steps that we'll describe here can be done manually, or you can use ProUCL or any other statistical program. ProUCL, it's a pretty nice piece of statistical program that was developed by the EPA and can be downloaded for free from the EPA website. But if you feel like doing this manually or have another statistical program you like to use, that's fine. So we went here and collected some samples, and we got some answers back ranging from 24 to 36. And I left that. If you can back up one slide, please. I left this 34 here sort of out of sequence for a reason. I'm going to do something with that later, and that was a handy spot to put it at. So next slide. So we said the first thing we've got to do is make sure that our data is kind of well behaved. It follows a normal log normal distribution. You can do it manually, but in this case, I used ProUCL just because it gives me a nice graph and it gives me a little message on the right-hand side that says my data is normally distributed. This is for those who are interested. This is called a QQ plot. Basically, it just tells you that your data follows the expected theoretic normal distribution, and there's other statistics you can run that will give you the same answer, or you can just plot it out by hand and see if you get a bell curve. Either way, for this particular data set, the answer you see up here says data appeared normal. So good. Next slide. I just want to make sure that there are no outliers. In other words, you don't have any data points out there all by them. They're lonesome. This is what's called a box plot, basically a cute little way of showing the range of the data here. You can see that, well, our results are from 24 to 36, and most of our data are from 26 to 32, and there's no loose points above or below the graph there. And there's other statistics you can run if you're using ProUCL. Whenever they give you a report that says, well, you know, neither your low numbers nor your high numbers are outliers. So we're happy that we have a well-behaved data set here. So we'll go to the next slide. So like I said, when we ran the analysis, or when I made up the numbers, whichever way you want to look at it, 36 was the highest number. So we're saying that 36 parts per million will be our background concentration for arsenic at this site. Now, use that to compare our results from our AOCs, and suppose you get a number that's higher than 36. Well, you got to go back and try to resolve that that question. Is it really because we didn't characterize background adequately, or is it because, in fact, the site is trying to tell us that the contamination may be related to the site, or what? So when that happens, we just need to make sure we work the data, work the site until we get an answer. Next slide. I told you that I was going to do something with that 34 on the lower right hand of the table there. So suppose that instead of my highest number being 36, I have a 53. Next slide. When I look at my my data and I put it through the program, it tells me, you see the graph that is in the background, it says that, it's probably not normal, but if you look at the graph that's in foreground, it says that, well, the data appears to be log normal. So, well, at least, all right, the data kind of sort of makes sense for environmental data. Next slide. When I do the box plot now, you see that, well, most of the data are between 24 and 36, and most of the data is kind of sort of in between that, but there is that one little point up there all by its lonesome way up the top of the curve. That's an outlier. If you're using ProUCL, you can get all kinds of reports and outputs that tell you that that's an outlier, or you can do it manually. There's a little calculation that is listed in the guidance document that you can do that will tell you that's in fact an outlier. Well, so it's an outlier. So what do we do with it? Well, basically one of two things. You can either ignore it and not use it and just take 36 as the answer, or if we say, well, we took the sample, it's an answer that we got from the site, go next to it, near it, take another sample from the same interval, analyze it the same way, and if you still get an answer that is within 20% of the first sample, average the two. So if this case here, the answer was 53, we go 5 feet over, take another sample from the same interval, the answer comes back, I don't know, 45 or 60. Well, that means that whatever it is, it's real and repeatable. So you'll average 53 plus the new answer, and that becomes the maximum value. That becomes the number that you use as a background. Next slide. So that pretty much says what I just what we just discussed here. And again, if your areas of concern or your site data keeps showing concentrations higher than what you determined to be the highest background concentration, that's something that needs to be resolved. That means that you got to look further either into how you determine background or what is your site data trying to tell you. Next slide. Alternatively, instead of doing this procedure, if you decide that that your data justifies it, that your site condition justifies or whatever, there are more advanced statistical methods that you can use to evaluate your background data. There's more advanced statistical methods that you can use to compare your AOC results to your background results. That's fine. Go ahead, do it. Just make sure you explain it all in the report. You include all your data, all your calculations. And with that, we are up to break and questions, or questions and break.
Great. Thank you very much, Ted. So let's get ready to question. Want everybody to wake up because this is a great opportunity. You realize these are the people that wrote the guidance. You have a fantastic opportunity to ask some questions. This guidance is going to be used later on, so let's try to figure out maybe clarifications now. So this is your opportunity to do so. I know it's on Friday. What's that, Dick? Dick wants to know if we can stone them. The answer is no. Absolutely not. So we're going to start questions, and we will give preference to the people that actually drove to Trenton today. We certainly appreciate that, especially on a Friday. So we have a question in the back. You guys want to stand up here and actually answer the questions? That would be great.
For the site investigation report, do you recommend calculation of the contaminant mass?
You haven't delineated anything, so I think calculating contaminant mass would be premature, but if you think you collected enough samples that you know something, it certainly is an appropriate step at some point in the process. I'm not sure that the site investigation is going to be something that gives you enough information to do that.
Did you mean after the entire process or just in the site investigation, Bill?
Dick thinks you can have enough data.
I guess when you have enough data.
Right, because I think I agree. I think once you get through the entire process, that is a great value to come up with. But I don't think you're still gathering data in the remedial investigation.
You're still gathering data. I mean, it's certainly important to start thinking about it. Start, looking at your conceptual site model. You might know how much already leaked. You might know where it went. Start thinking about it, but it's probably premature to actually put it in your report. And if you put it in your report, you might want to mention that it might be premature.
All right. Thank you, Kathi. Another question from the audience? Got one in the back?
Ted, for the statistical, does the guidance go into non-detects and detection limits as part of the statistical testing?
No, the guidance does not address that. If you're using Pro-UCL, it uses certain bootstrapping methods to account for that. But the guidance doesn't really specify a way for handling non-detects.
Additional questions from the audience? Seeing none, we'll go to the web. We have one from Caitlin Tonner. Are there timeframes that the PASI need to be submitted for non-ISRA or non-regulated tank sites? Kathi?
No.
Excellent answer. I like that. Short and sweet. The answer is
The
no.
only thing that you would need to consider is if you do your SI and you identify impact, then you've triggered the need to do your receptor evaluation. DEP people help me if I think that that's definitely a time frame you would trigger. Your public notice is something you would trigger when you identified impact. But in terms of regulatory or in terms of mandatory time frames, the PASI is tied to ISRA and regulated UST.
So I knew Kathi couldn't just say that. No. She's very comprehensive.
And I'm sleepy.
Hold on.
Would that also be tied to a discharge? So if you have a discharge, then you have your time frame starting.
If you have a discharge, you have your time frames, but a reportable discharge doesn't trigger the SI. You'd bump to the RI time frames, which you will see on Monday in the new rule.
All right, next question from the web is from Ed Kraft. Ms. Stetser mentioned that the QAAP, QAP, for the SI, we previously submitted QAP for the RIW. Is formal QAP required for site investigation, and must it be submitted with the SIR?
You will see that in subchapter 1 of the new tech regs that a QAP is going to be needed pretty much anytime you're collecting samples if the draft stays the same as the final.
Okay, thank you. Next question from David Nola. What was the thought process on pulling out the how from the tech regs and not just keeping it the way it was? I'll take that question.
I'd love to take it.
The whole question was the tech regs was believed to be, especially with the LSRPs and use of professional judgment, the difference in using a rule and varying from a rule is significant from departing from technical guidance. So the idea is we wanted to pull the how-to part out of the tech regs, put it in guidance. Therefore, it's a little bit easier to use, and also if you deviate from that or depart from that particular guidance, the requirements for you to justify that are less than if you had to justify the departure from a rule or variance from a rule. In addition to that, the whole LSRP program, the rules are to be performance-oriented or goals that you need to reach. The guidance is just how you would get there, and there's many ways to reach those goals, as everyone knows. Oh, what's that?
That one looked interesting.
Next question from Kimberly Finnegan. Did I hear that the quality assurance plan needs to be submitted with the SI report?
I'm pretty sure that's going to end up in the final rule, but read it on Monday.
Stay tuned. We will hopefully see that on Monday, and again, we're as far as we know, that will occur on Monday. Question from Scott Jackson. Kathi, if there has been an NFA issued for a single AOC at a site and you are performing a site-wide investigation, as an LSRP, should you just accept that NFA that was issued, or is it reasonable to question the NFA? And this is a very hot topic.
It is, but I don't think it's that ambiguous. At least personally, I don't consider this an ambiguous question. If you're issuing a site-wide RAO, you have to be comfortable with all the work that was ever done before. If you look behind that NFA and you see that they collected samples that are substantially in compliance with the current rule, that you, in your professional judgment, feel it is adequately protective of human health and the environment, by all means say that in your report. But if you look at the sampling of a vapor degreaser from 15 years ago and it got an NFA and they only sampled for TPH, probably not a good idea to rely on that NFA.
Right. Again, professional judgment always comes into play in there. Question from Caitlin Tyner. Oh, she thanked you. Question from Michael Mankoff. What if you collected a dupe and the dupe was much higher than the original? Is the data rejected in the outlier evaluation? Ted?
If the dupe is within 20% of the original sample, then you just go ahead, average the two, and that's your answer. I think if your dupe is so far out from its split, I think you're going to have data validation issues with your RPD, and you're probably going to just reject both samples because there's something strange going on with the samples, and you got to understand what's going on before you go back and take another sample.
Okay, great. That's all the questions that was on the web. Do we have any additional ones from the audience? Seeing none, I have 10:04. We will round up to 10:05 and be back here at 10:15, and we will start the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
Well, actually, no.
Everyone can please take their seats. It would be greatly appreciated. I have 10:15, and we just want to maintain track. Okay, we're gonna start again with the second part of the presentation. So right now we're going to have John Doyon come up, and he's going to talk about remedial investigation. Again, we'll have a question and answer period following this, and any questions we don't get to, we will make sure to address them. So thank you.
All right, hello everybody again. Here to talk to you about remedial investigation of soil. So, primary purpose of conducting remedial investigation. You've conducted your site investigation and you've discovered that you have exceedances and you've recommended that additional sampling is needed. Once you get into the remedial investigation phase, basically what you're needing or trying to do is delineating the extent vertically and horizontally, the extent of the contamination that's been found. This is supposed to be done for each AOC where you find an exceedance. Some of the other objectives in conducting a remedial investigation are identifying immediate environmental concerns, migration paths and receptor exposures, and also developing containment or stabilization remedies when these things are discovered, along with hotspots. Okay, my button's not working. Okay, here we go. All right, some other objectives are identifying ecological issues, whether there's a risk assessment that needs to be conducted, what the surface and subsurface characteristics are of the geology. If you need to collect soil data to develop permits for remedial activities, this would be done during this phase. There we go. Also, completing or updating the conceptual site model. I know Kathi went into that to some extent. Really, the way I look at the conceptual site model is it's kind of a picture that you're drawing from the PA. You might be putting in some very rough lines during your PA. The SI, you might be adding some shading, and hopefully by the time you finish the RI, you have a complete picture of what you're looking at. And by doing that, you provide yourself with enough information or complete information where you can make good remedial decisions and reaching that ultimate goal of protection of human health and the environment. Just to go over the conceptual site model a little bit more, what is it going to get you? It's going to hopefully describe the expected source of where the contaminant came from, give you the extent of the area of contamination, identify relevant environmental media, things like soil, groundwater, what's been impacted, what the exposure pathways are, transport and fate pathways also. There's a reason. So in order to do that, how do we go about collecting that data or getting the data pool that we need to make those decisions? The most common method that we use is called judgmental sampling, basically going out and collecting sample data based on professional judgment, typically using a step-out approach in a three-dimensional fashion. I'm having trouble with this. Okay. Next, okay. So basically, when you're doing judgmental sampling, you're going to be using your professional judgment to determine your frequency and your location of your samples. Things that you'll be taking into consideration are soil properties and how they affect the contaminant migration path, the actual physical and chemical nature of the contaminant itself. Is it a DNAPL, LNAPL? Are there degradation properties or degradation daughter products, types of things like that that you need to take into account? The manner of the release of the contamination, was it a surface spill, was it a subsurface spill, timing and duration, things like how long ago was the spill, did the spill occur, was it a leak that occurred over a period of years, was it a one-time event, and if you are able to get the information on the volume of release. All of these things come into play when you're trying to make the determination of those locations and those frequencies, and basically gives you the information to determine what I call the 3 Ds, your distance, your direction, and your depth of your sample. And you basically go ahead and use the same logic when you're doing subsequent step-outs when iterative samples also have exceedances. Okay, I'm a visual learner, so I like to do visual representations of this. So this is just a very simple illustration kind of describing what a judgmental sampling approach is. So you take your SI samples, and it turns out that one of those samples has an exceedance. So you go ahead and you take your step-out samples, and again you get additional exceedances. And then you iterative approach, you take additional samples, and you find another exceedance, and so on, until you get to the point where your iterative samples no longer exceed the standards, and it gives you your area of contamination, your extent of contamination. Okay, there we go. Another method not used nearly as often is the probabilistic sampling techniques. These can be used when you really don't have a clear understanding of the source of the contamination, and the characteristics of the actual contaminant don't allow for biases. You can't use a field screening tool to bias your sampling. Typically it would be used for something like historic fill, or if you're looking to maybe get an upper confidence level using statistical analysis. Another time would be when you're looking at fallout from a stack emission. Some of the examples of probabilistic sampling is adaptive cluster sampling, rank set sampling, and stratified sampling. I'm going to go into incremental sampling a little bit. It's incremental sampling. There was a document that was put out recently by the ITRC, Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council. It's basically a very structured composite sampling protocol. Going the wrong way here. Let me go back here. Okay. The purpose here is to develop or provide information about the decision unit or the area that you're sampling. It's going to give you a reduction in data variability over, say, your normal composite sampling or discrete sampling, and increase the sample representativeness of that decision unit. It uses a systematic planning approach, and if you're interested, the web address for the downloading the document is indicated at the bottom of the page here. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, on the left here is a representation of sampling a area using a discrete sampling approach where you, say, grab 9 samples. Looking at that same area or decision unit boundary, to the right there are 2 approaches using traditional composite sampling. The one to the very right probably a little bit more structured and robust than the one to the left. Compare that to incremental sampling. In this scenario, you're looking at basically the same decision unit boundary. However, you're collecting 60 samples and compositing them into one, and then you're going to be collecting 2 replicate samples, a total of 180. where you have them combined, and then you're comparing the three together to make sure that they are representative of the area. We do actually have, I believe, yeah, Frank Camera was one of the members of the ITRC team, so if you do have questions about this, I'm not an expert in any stretch of the imagination. Frank has offered to provide answers or try to respond to any questions you might have at the end of the session. All right, moving on. Another approach that you can use is delineation using field screening. Typically, we don't allow field screening, or I shouldn't say typically, we don't allow field screening for identifying the contamination at the site or to identify a full clean zone. However, there are scenarios where if you're collecting more than 10 samples in an area of concern, that you can use up to 50% of field screening methods to document the area as clean. You really have to be sure of the contaminants of concern that you're looking at and be comfortable with the field screening methods in these scenarios. In speaking with our resident QA people, there are, situations where we would consider using more than 50% field screening methods. Let's say you have a GCMS at a site, and you know the contaminant is benzene. Then in those scenarios, we would entertain the use of more than 50%. However, in those situations, you would need to obtain a variance. All right. Again, using some illustrations here. Okay, you've got a drum spill area. You take your initial SI samples. There are exceedances there. And then you go ahead and you delineate the area of concern. You've got, using a field screening method, you've got, say, 11 samples that show your clean area or your clean zone. In this scenario, 5 of those samples would not require laboratory confirmation. Okay. Another method is delineation through extrapolation. Typically, if you're trying to move from the RI and you don't want to do an additional iter of samples, you want to move into the RA, this is a method that allows you to do that. If you can show a decreasing trend, 10% from the initial with 2 sequential samples, or if you have an order of 5 reduction from your initial sample to the single delineation sample beyond that, you can use extrapolation to move you into the RA phase. You can also use a reasonable combination of laboratory analysis and field screening. However, once you're in the RA phase, before you complete the remedial action, you do still need to do confirmation sampling using laboratory analysis. And here's another illustration. If I can get it to move. Here we go. Okay. So in this scenario, your initial sample is your 10. When you step out, you've got sequential samples of 9, and then again, another step out, 8.1, where you see there's a reduction, 10%, at least a 10% reduction in your step-out samples. And in those scenarios, you can extrapolate out to whatever the standard is. I did put an 8.5 here just to show you that in those scenarios, you couldn't use that for extrapolation. Okay. Now, when you're sampling vertically and you hit the groundwater table, if you have not reached the resident or the applicable standard that you're trying to obtain, then you still need to go beyond into the saturated zone. And you need to delineate to whatever the applicable direct contact remediation standard is. Once you get there, of course, the impact groundwater number is no longer relevant. If you do have contaminants that have a solubility greater than 100 milligrams per liter, you also need to delineate to the residual, or delineate or identify residual product. We also moved the information about restricted use. There was a section in the regulation that was moved to the guidance that provided some alleviation when it comes to a site where you know that the future use is going to be restricted and the property owner is agreeing to put a deed notice on the property. You don't have to delineate to the residential number in those scenarios. However, in that scenario, you would still need to delineate to the impacted groundwater number if that number is lower than the residential, or I'm sorry, the non-residential. And you would, in that scenario, also need to determine that there's no contaminants migrating off-site above the residential numbers. This doesn't always benefit you, and I wanted to provide some additional illustrations to show that. So if you have an area of concern and you've delineated to the restricted use number, you could either delineate that area of concern to the residential number. In this scenario, you're going to have to do 12 additional samples, say. However, if you were to use the previous discussion, take it to the property boundary, you might have to collect 16 samples. So in a scenario like this, it wouldn't actually benefit you. So when would it benefit you? Let's say you had 7 areas of concern, and it took you some additional samples to get to the residential numbers in those areas of concern, totaling 70 samples. Now, that's going to be a definite benefit in this scenario where you would go out and do the boundary sampling and not have to sample to the residential numbers or the residential extent at each of these areas of concern. So that's a scenario where that would be a benefit. All right. Just wanted to touch base. The regulation actually has a detailed provides a detailed analysis of the mandatory timeframes for the different scenarios. The only scenario it doesn't have in it, which remains in the statute, is this one. If your contamination was discovered prior to May 7, 1999, you still need to submit the remedial investigation report by May 7, 2014. And that's it for me. I'm going to hand it back to Ted.
And so we come to the last chapter of the guidance document. Remedial action verification sampling. We have done our SI, have done our RI, have done our remedial action, and it's now time to prove that, in fact, we accomplished what we had promised to accomplish. Next slide. And in not as many words, this section simply will give us some ideas for how to go about documenting that our remediation has been successful. We will be discussing methods for verification sampling based on perhaps the different types of remedial action that we can have. So next slide. Single-phase remediations, such things as a tank removal, for example. It's the same as some of the other things some of the other cases we'll be discussing, even though single-phase remediations are sometimes regarded as being a special case. But from the standpoint of remediation for verification sampling, we would go about it as if we're any other normal, well, not normal, but if it's any other type of remedial action. So next, starting with removal actions with soil excavation. We can use RI samples as long as they were collected at the appropriate locations and we have enough samples. Sometimes we like to call these pre-X, post-X samples. You know, we've already collected the samples. We have removed up to the sampling locations. We can use those results, like I said, as long as an adequate number of samples has been collected and analyzed for the right parameters and so forth. But suppose we don't, then we got to go take samples from scratch. And generally, the rule that we want to use is take one sample every 30 feet along the sidewall. Generally speaking, the guidance recommends taking samples at the top of the bottom of the wall and one sample every 900 square feet of bottom area. But you got to look at what you know about the remediation area. For example, if we know for a fact that the release says that impacted only the bottom of the excavation area, and we have RI data that shows that the upper, so many feet of soil had not been impacted, well, perhaps you have a basis for not having to take a sample at the top of the excavation wall, even though you dug the hole, but it was not really impacted. Or you know something about the shape of the release or whatever. So these numbers are your starting point, but use your professional judgment to go from there. Next slide. That's just a quick illustration of what we just said. Let's just assume that we have an excavation, let's say 30 feet wide, 60 feet long. We will take a couple of samples on the bottom and along the walls, one sample every 30 feet. You see that there's an extra dot on the right-hand side in the middle of the section there. That's not an error. That's just a reminder that there may be times when you want to take an extra sample because you just saw something on the side wall that makes you wonder, well, did we really remove everything that we needed to remove here or not? So again, use your judgment. Next slide. Obviously, we want to bias our sampling locations based on what we know about the remediation area. So, if we had RI data that showed us that one area of the excavation might have been more contaminated than another or whatever, we want to bias our sampling towards the area that is the most questionable one. In this photograph, perhaps you would say, well, maybe we should bias our sampling towards these darker spots because, well, we have data that shows that that we had some exceedances there, and we want to make sure that we got them all. Plus, it's a nice photograph. Next slide. We're now going to look at cases where we did not excavate and dispose of site, but in fact we treated material in situ, whether it was chemox or stabilization or whatever. Again, we want to take maybe one sample per 900 square feet of treated area footprint. but your treated area will typically be a three-dimensional thing. So we want to take samples every 2-foot slice depth. At every 2-foot layers going down. But again, that's only a starting point in the thought process. You got to take a look at the process that you use, talk to your vendor, understand what did the treatment do, and modify the sampling program accordingly. Also, you may get to the point where, especially if you have a large treatment area, you want to vary the number of samples up or down. Next slide. The thing about most in situ remediation methods is that you will add some reagent to your subsurface. You may do some physical operation like adding heat to it or whatever. Those result in some changes to the natural chemistry of the site soils. You introduce an oxidant. You will raise the oxidation potential of your site. You put in a reductant. Again, you're changing your redox in the other direction. You may, as a result of your chemical addition, you may move your pH left or right. You're adding heat to it. You're changing the mobility of some of the contaminants. So you got to consider all those things when you're selecting sampling locations and analytical parameters, and also you got to think about the kinetics of your reaction. Some things happen real fast. You can take samples fairly shortly after you completed the remediation. Some things take time to complete. You got to let things equilibrate before you go out to sample if you want to get good answers. Which parenthetically reminds me that early on in the guidance document, there's about a one-page discussion of data quality objectives. And this is definitely one of those cases where you want to stop and take the hour and put things down on a piece of paper and convince yourself that you're that you're designing a post-remediation sampling program that will in fact give you the answers that you want at the level that you want them with the resolution that you want them. So just by way of illustration, next sample. Let's say that there is naturally occurring arsenic at our site. We're going out to do a remedial action. Arsenic occurs in at least from an environmental mobility standpoint, two oxidation states: arsenic 3, arsenic 5. Arsenic 3 is mobile. Arsenic 5 is relatively immobile. Arsenic 5 is an oxidized state. Arsenic 3 is a reduced state. What we're showing here is your typical redox diagram that shows the state in which a metal will occur depending on redox conditions. In other words, pH and EH. The thick line on the diagram sort of separates the arsenic 3 from arsenic 5 stability regions. So if we went out and did a remedial action and it was a a process, in situ treatment process that involved some type of a reductive application, you could move your your ambient, you will move your ambient site conditions to the reductive zone, and in the reductive environment, arsenic would be mobile. So you got to consider that when you're taking your post treatment samples. Not only will we have to show that we met the objectives of addressing the contaminant of concern, but also want to make sure that in the process we didn't mobilize something else. And of course, especially when you're dealing with something like arsenic, it's not just whether you've changed the redox system. It's also what else is in your natural environment. So if there's iron, if there's manganese, if there's sulfur, those things will all play into the ultimate answer of whether, in this case, arsenic would be mobilized. So, in this many words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a whole host of other chemical reactions that will take place in the course of remedial action, and we have to take those into consideration, take them into consideration in our remedial action confirmatory sampling work plan, and look for the right things, just so that we know that in trying to address our problem, we did not inevitably create another problem. Next slide. Another remedial approach may be to treat soils ex situ. You dig them out of the ground, you put them through some treatment train, and now they're treated. Once they're treated, you can return them to the site, or you can take them some other place. If you're going to reuse them, we have the alternative and clean fill guidance, and we have to handle material for use according to that. If we're just going to take it off to a landfill for disposal, then the usual disposal requirements, both of the department as well as the receiving facilities, must be followed. Next. We've already hit on some of these points, but there's generally a number of things we have to consider, regardless of what method we use for remediation when we're doing our confirmatory sampling. We need to be biasing our samples towards what we know to have been the most contaminated areas. As John mentioned earlier, if we had based our delineation on gradients and extrapolation, well, now it's the moment of truth. Now we have to take the samples to demonstrate that, in fact, our extrapolation was correct and that we have met our cleanup goals. And finally, if we're going to bring fill to the site, say backfill and excavation or whatever, we've got to do that in accordance with the alternative and clean fill guidance. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. Again, this is your second and last opportunity today to ask questions. A lot of information was presented, so we would hope that either it was fantastically clear and everybody understands, or there are a few questions and clarifications that we could provide. So At this time, we'll open it up to questions, and please wait if you do have questions in the audience for the microphone. So any questions? Everybody's awake, right? I know it's Friday. It was good presentation, good information. All right, we have no questions within the audience. Let's see. Oh, we got plenty on the web, though. We have one from David Carlson. Reporting obligations for detected upgrading impact. At the site investigation stage, you simply detect a positive, possibly at the property line, but only a detection. Should a call to the hotline incorrectly implicating your site be recalled using an upgrading address when the upgrading source is provided? John?
I do not have an answer to that question.
Anyone else have an answer? Anybody want to take that one on? All right, David, we'll have to get an answer back to you. That's a kind of an interesting question. But we'll make sure to get you an answer on that one. So we're going to move on to Robert Jackson. If a site has received an approval to use the 1999 RDCS-CC, can a new case investigating a previously closed case use the same criteria? And should a new LSRP accept the old standards? I'm looking at you because I'm not sure what that...
That's a remediation standard question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but my feeling would be that they wouldn't be able to use the previous standards for a new investigation.
Yeah, again, I agree. Professional judgment would certainly come into play. You have to make the decision as an LSRP whether that is appropriate or not, and if it is protective, because the ultimate responsibility for any LSRP is to make sure that whatever you do at the site results in protectiveness of the environment, human health as well.
One thing they don't say whether or not an NFA was issued on that. It's just an approval for it. So.
Yeah, I think it's just to use those standards in conducting the investigation remediation. Another one from Robert Jackson. If a conceptual site model is not a requirement, why is there so much emphasis placed on it? And if you guys don't have an answer for that, I certainly do. But John?
Well, because we think it's a good tool to use to really give you an idea of what's out at the site. And like I said, it draws that picture for you, and you can really get a lot of information and make really good decisions based on the information that's collected in that format.
I'd also add to that, in every technical guidance committee that I was involved in, the conceptual site model was probably one of the most important things, most important tools that everybody encouraged to be used at a site for a couple reasons. Number one, that is really you telling the story of the site, putting all the information together and coming up with a perception of what is going on at the site. And so without that framework, without that tool, I'm not sure if there's a better way to understand what's going on the site or a better way to at least tell someone else what's going on at the site. So the conceptual site model, I think, is a very effective tool for you to continue to conduct your remediation. And in addition, it's kind of a living document. As you get additional information, you update that so that your understanding is more comprehensive about what's going on at the site. So I think it's very important. I've always encouraged the use of a conceptual site model. So I think that's my public service announcement. Kathi, do you have something to add to that?
Keep in mind that a conceptual site model can mean very different things for different kinds of sites. If you've got one single AOC that's not complicated, the conceptual site model might be a bullet list and a picture in your head. But you should be thinking about source pathway receptors and those factors. For a big complicated site that has 20 AOCs and a couple different aquifers and some wetlands, then maybe it's actually something big that you put down on paper and you have cross sections. But you really tailor your conceptual site model to your needs. So don't always think that I've got one little tiny AOC and I've got to spend $10,000 developing a conceptual site model. That's not what it means. So read the guidance.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have a repeat question from David Carlson. And again, it's reporting obligations for detected upgrading impact. Again, this involves a site investigation stage when you simply detect a positive. Should you be calling the hotline, which may incorrectly implicate your site? Recalling using an upgrading address when the upgrading source is provided. And Sarah, is there any protection from legal action by the upgrading property owner for the LSRP who reports that upgraded contamination? I think that is, we have Dick Katz in the front row, and Dick says no. But again, this is a little bit outside the the information that was presented here. A little bit off topic, but we can find an answer for you, David. Again, for all the web audience, any questions that you do submit, we have your contact information, and we'll commit to getting you an answer on that if we don't answer it here. So we will find a little bit better, more comprehensive answer for you and get back to you. Next question from Mark Murata, a scenario question. You have soil samples not in the saturated zone that is above the impacted groundwater, but below the residential. Also, temporary point installed at that location, groundwater is collected and results are below the groundwater quality standards. Would this be applicable to RAO unrestricted and RDCSRS, I hate acronyms, and not the impacted groundwater since the groundwater sample is below the groundwater quality standards? Kathy, come on. Shaking your head. You need a mic there. You can't just shake your head.
It's complicated, and I'm definitely not an expert on this. You need to look at the groundwater guidance. You need to look at the impacted groundwater standard guidance, because you don't just get out of jail free because your soil sample's dirty but your groundwater sample's clean. You need to look at, is it a mobile or an immobile contaminant? There's methodologies that you need to use to do that evaluation. It's just not that straightforward.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question from Fraser Thomas. In the discussion on restricted use, Mr. Doyen raised the use of property boundary measurements in cases where there is an agreement to a deed notice. Could he provide an example of where use of this strategy, this is not considered appropriate? For example, where site conditions would prevent the use of this approach. John?
Well, if your future use of the property is not going to be a restricted use, then that would be certainly a scenario where it wouldn't be appropriate to use this. Not sure what he means by site conditions would prevent use. If I could maybe get an example of what site conditions. But basically, if you're going to be using it, if it's a restricted use on a property, it's going to remain industrial or commercial. There's not going to be a child care center there or something like along those lines, then it would be appropriate, assuming that the property owner is in agreement and the deed notice would have to be for the whole site.
Okay, thank you. From David Carlson, if a site with an RAW or RAR and NFA approved pre-December 2008 is included, it's an ISRA site. What is the specific soil sampling requirements? Sample locations were appropriate and no direct contact or inhalation ingestion standards are reopened by the order of magnitude analysis. What's the challenge? Is there any impact to groundwater standards, old, or requirement or guidance? Did you follow that? I did my best to read it, John. I really did.
I think
it's a tough one.
Take a stab.
I don't know if you know. If it's an ISRA site and it's an ISRA reopener and you do the order of magnitude analysis and you're okay on direct contact, and then the order of magnitude analysis doesn't apply to impacted groundwater for an ISRA reopener. If you're just going out and looking at a site, I don't know if the order of magnitude analysis necessarily applies. I just don't know. I can tell you on ISRA. I can't tell you anything else.
All right. And here's a question from Kimberly. I appreciate the short one. Is there a deadline between SIRI and RIRAW, et cetera? John, it sounds like it's a regulatory question there.
Well, I get the answer is yes. Kathy, do you want to expand?
The new rule is going to have all the timelines. Just read it on Monday.
Kathy, who was sitting in her seat without the microphone, said that it will be in the new rule, and to check that out on Monday. Question from Dana Boyadjian. Tried that, Dana. What are some acceptable field screening methods?
Field screening methods that I've seen used that are acceptable. Basically, if you look at the field sampling procedures manual, that covers pretty much all of the ones that are accepted there. If you look in the soil guidance document, it does indicate other documents. So there's a an EPA document that you can reference that will indicate what the field screening methods that are available and would be acceptable. If you're looking for techniques that are out there, just as an example, using a PID and FID, XRF, field GCMS, mobile laboratories, these are all techniques that you can use to get those real-time or quick turnaround times for your samples, so you really have a better idea in the field what you're dealing with.
In addition, I'd throw in there, and we always do, the use of professional judgment if new technology comes up. You as the LSRP do certainly have the ability to justify the use of a field screening technique, but really it's up to you to justify its application. Here's a question from Ed Kraft. RIRA. What are, I'm sorry. Yep. RIRA. What are examples of cases that would be exceptions? John, did you talk about exceptions? Not sure what that question is.
It says, is a written RAW always required prior to, I guess, the RI report or remedial action? What are examples of cases that would be exceptions? I believe that the RI report is a key document, and I guess it would always be required, unless it's a single-phase remediation.
All right, thank you. One from Michael Fontana. Does a deed notice for soil now have to include IGSCC data from the saturated zone?
No. I'm assuming the IG is the impacted groundwater number, and you're not looking at impacted groundwater.
I think we're missing a W there, but yeah.
In the saturated zone, and you don't really include, I don't think you include the impacted groundwater numbers in the deed notice. It's really just for direct contact purposes.
Okay. Question from David Nola. In the figure for verification sampling, is this figure for both surface and subsurface sampling, or is this a change in sampling protocol?
I'm not sure that I entirely understand the question, but the discussion was really about, you know, a three-dimensional excavation where, in fact, you have both horizontal and vertical extent, but I'm not sure I understand the question completely.
Okay. We'll move on then, even though they've left. Slide 45, with all the step-out samples, suggests that there is a very high likelihood of contamination near the three clean original samples, northwest and south of the drum pad. Do you agree? This is an interpretation of that slide. I don't know if we had that.
I'm going to try and find the slide. So
I'll tell you what, John, you go back, you look at that slide for a second, we'll get back to you. We'll move on to another question, just so we don't waste some time here. When completing verification sampling, is it acceptable to use both RI samples and post-X samples in order to meet frequency requirements?
Yes.
Clear answer to that is yes. No additional explanation needed. One from Kathleen Worley. For questions that cannot be answered during the webinar that will be followed up offline, the answers should be circulated to all participants, if possible via email. Other participants may benefit from the answer as well. Kathleen, that's a very good point. Actually, we're trying to find out a way to do that. Typically, right now, we only answer to the question, the person who posed the question, but we're trying to collect all those answers and post them on the website. That's kind of a information systems problem that we're trying right now, is how to collect them, post them, compile them. But we are working on it, and that is a great comment. One from Desmond Hayes. I have a site which is utilizing clean fill based off the prior standards and regs, with lesser sampling required. With the standards changing next week, will the new regs take precedent over the old, thus requiring more stringent sampling, or will the previous regs still apply?
Well, it's not really.
Oh, hold on.
It's not really regulation at this point. It's guidance. And if that were my case, I would say that you have to use your professional judgment to say whether the sampling results the sampling data that you have are representative of your backfill or not, and if, as the professional, you feel that this characterizes it, well, it doesn't meet the number of samples of the new guidance, but you have a variance, but it's justifiable for this and this reason.
Thanks, Ted. Another question from David Carlson. QT, I'm not sure what QT is.
Question 2.
Question 2. Is gradient extrapolation acceptable to complete RI in regard to impacted groundwater criteria?
My understanding of the impact of groundwater criteria is really it's a trigger to tell you to go and look at the groundwater. I guess you're also delineating impact groundwater?
Swati will answer this.
Okay, we've got somebody in the audience that's going to answer.
The question on delineation, you can use the same things for delineating to impact groundwater as you would use for all the other standards. The impact to groundwater, again, is for future impacts, and so it's not necessarily linked with the whether the groundwater is clean or not.
Okay.
But in terms of delineation, yes, you can extrapolate the way you would delineation for any of the other residential direct contact standards.
Okay, great. That was Swati Topin, who's a DEP rep. Thank you very much for that clarification. Where are we, Ian, at the top there?
We can do the top one.
Okay, John?
I just want to basically explain that the slide 45 was the, I guess, the first illustration with the drum pad, and I showed initially four samples around the pad that were SI samples. And the comment was that it looks like maybe those three other original samples might be there might be contamination close to them. Well, it was just an illustration to explain how you would define an area of extent. Wasn't really used to try and imply anything else. So I really can't speak to the comment, I guess.
Okay. Move on to Ed Kraft. Is RAW required for hotspot remediation, not intended to bring the AOC into compliance with standards, or for IRM? You guys understand that one?
I think you can use the soil verification sampling in a hotspot removal also. It's going to be used for a different purpose, I guess, if you're not delineating, but you're just trying to get that hotspot out. But again, that's something that I think where a professional judgment would come into play. If it's an IEC condition, you would have to follow the IEC protocols.
Okay. Move on to a second question from Ed. It was stated that 50% field screening can be used for an AOC when greater than 10 samples are collected. Can it be used for delineation if contamination may be the result of several nearby AOCs not separated by a clean zone?
Yeah, that's a situation that I think it gets pretty murky when you're combining AOCs and you're talking about different contaminants of concern. That's, again, I think that's an area where you'd probably want to use your professional judgment to make a determination. If you don't feel comfortable using the field screening for delineation purposes in that scenario, don't. If you do, then I would say go ahead.
All right, thank you. And the last question from David Intanola. In the past sampling, subsurface sampling only dealt with subsurface conditions, not surface sampling as the figure indicates. Ted, you want to take that?
Yeah. If we have the data that shows that the impacts were only at depth, even though we may have to dig all the way down to get to it, then your sampling is focused in the area that has been impacted, but the guidance addresses the question in a more generic sort of way that, well, if you have this big if you have a remedial action that's addressing the entire soil column and the entire soil column has been impacted, you have to take enough samples to demonstrate that the entire soil column has been remediated. But if only a specific interval has been affected, then your sampling needs to focus on that and not the entire soil column, because presumably you already know that from other sampling you have done.
Okay, great. Oh, and David said thanks for the clarification. So thank you, David. Are there any questions from our audience? I see none. So I would thank the presenters. Thank you for working through those questions. Not always easy. And I'd also thank participants on the web and also the audience. And I would encourage you, please, 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 to take just a few minutes, since we are ending early, to fill out those evaluation forms. We certainly take them into consideration. So thank you very much and have a good day.